Good evening. Good evening and welcome to Q&A. We're live from the Dockland studios. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group, Ines Willox, Council of Social Services Head, Cassandra Goldie, Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Leigh, Assistant Treasurer, Kelly O'Dwyer, and the Greens Treasury Spokesman, Adam Bandt. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. And you can watch this very live Q&A audience across Australia on ABC TV and ABC News 24 and listen on News Radio. Let's go to our very first question, which is from Sam Russell.
Thanks, Tony. My question's first up for the Assistant Treasurer, but then to the whole panel for comment. In 2009, then Opposition Leader Malcolm Turnbull lost his leadership based on principles. He believed an ETS was the most efficient and equitable manner in which to combat climate change, and that a marriage equality was possible without a divisive plebiscite. As an independent, socially progressive, fiscally conservative voter, my peers and friends keep telling me that the Labor Party and Bill Shorten aren't ready to form government, and that all Malcolm Turnbull requires is a mandate in his own name. But who am I voting for this election? Am I voting for the 2009 Malcolm Turnbull or the 2016 Malcolm Turnbull?
Kelly O'Dwyer.
Well, thanks, Sam, for that question. And your friends are absolutely right when they say Bill Shorten is not ready to govern this country.
Are they right about the confusion as to what Malcolm Turnbull stands for?
Well, no, they're not right about that because Malcolm Turnbull hasn't changed. Malcolm Turnbull is exactly the same person that he always was. He's not like the two Julias. He's the same Malcolm, and he's the Malcolm that we all love. I mean, he's the guy who, of course, has successfully built up his own company. He's the guy who has been a strong contributor in the cabinet, and he's the man who will lead the nation to ensure that we will have jobs and growth in this country, that we will have an optimistic future, because we know that 25 years of uninterrupted economic growth doesn't just happen by accident. You need to make active choices, and we have got a national plan to make 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth.
Kelly, I'm just going to go back to our questioner who I think has been shaking his head, possibly wondering whether you're actually going to answer the whole question.
Look, I guess the crux of my question is it appears that in order to get the leadership of the Liberal Party, Malcolm Turnbull made a Faustian bargain with the hard right of his party. And that concerns me, and I guess I'm sick of politicians pandering to the extremes of their party. And I just wish they were more forthright and upfront with us. We're an intelligent populace and we're here to make this country really, on the right track.
You're right. The Australian people are very intelligent, and Malcolm Turnbull's views on climate change are very well known. He believes that we need to do something about climate change. We need to reduce emissions. His views on same-sex marriage are well known. He, like I, believe that we need to make changes to the Marriage Act. But that's not the view of all of our party, and we do represent the broad cross-section of the Australian people. Now, it has been determined that there should be a public vote on whether or not we should have same-sex marriage. And frankly, I'm comfortable with letting the Australian people decide because I think they share my view on this issue.
The questioner just said there by Tony Abbott. The microphone wasn't there.
Well, no. It was actually decided by the Coalition Party room. We all argued it out in the party room, as you would expect. It was a very intelligent conversation and it went for, I think, a record 6 hours.
OK, let's hear from the rest of the panel. Adam Bandt, I'll start with you. And why is there confusion among some voters as to what Malcolm Turnbull stands for?
Well, I think Malcolm Turnbull's approach is, these are my principles and if you don't like them, I've got others. And I think there's... I think you put your finger on it that he made a deal with the hard right of his party, the climate-denying rump, who they managed to get him to close down the Safe Schools program, for example. Now, here's someone who's meant to be a socially progressive but economically responsible Prime Minister who's quite happy to do it just when the hard right of his party arcs up about that. That, I think, was a litmus test for what's to come. And I know a lot of people would be hoping that he'll become better after the election. I think the signs tell us the opposite. And it's very, very telling. You mentioned climate change. go through the whole budget speech. I know the Treasurer gave that, the PM had a hand, not one mention of climate change. This should be the climate change election. And there's a lot to be gained from a Prime Minister saying, like other Conservative Prime Ministers do around the world, climate change is real, let's act on it, it'll set us up well. And the fact that he's run the other way suggests to me that you're actually a Greens voter.
Adam, I'm going to throw it round to the rest of the panel. Innes Willox, what do you think about the basis of this question, that there are people who are uncertain out there as to what Malcolm Turnbull actually stands for?
Well, people are always uncertain at election time. We have 53 days for the people to make up their minds from what they see. It's a very long time. Where we come from is that, we're into policy, not politics, and we want good policy outcomes. And that's what we're focused on from a business community and then from a broader community perspective.
So was the business community uncertain too until the company tax cuts were announced?
Look, I think the company tax cut was the right policy decision, and it was phased in over 10 years, and we're going to have a discussion about that over the next 53 days. So from our perspective, we're into substance over style. We're not into three-word slogans. Is substance over style a three-word slogan? But we're into the real meat of policy. And what the government put forward in the budget we thought was an appropriate measure, something we'd been arguing for a very long time, because it will derive enormous economic benefits for Australia. Now, the government has to go and argue that. The business community has to argue that as well. And then the people will decide. Of course, there's been some confusion because, let's be honest, the government hasn't had a good 3 or 4 months. They've struggled to find traction. Now the rubber does hit the road, and it will really be up to the people to decide. I can't say any more than that. We just hope that they think wisely. They've never got it wrong before.
Okay, Cassandra, Goldie, go back to the question and let's see what you think about the idea that Malcolm Turnbull is confusing people.
Well, I guess the Prime Minister made a decision about the policies that he was going to back in this period of government, and the Parliament has just ended and we're now into an election period. And so this is what I hope to be democracy big time in action. Certainly we have a very clear view that marriage equality should have been delivered a long time ago, and we want to see it dealt with as quickly as possible. So now is the time. The time continues to be for the public to say what will really change your vote at the polls. Equally, these discussions about the choices around tax cuts or the way in which we need to fund essential services. I think what we're hoping to see, we certainly at ACOS are hoping to see, that we will have an election period. Yes, there'll be personalities, but it should definitely be about making sure that every one of you and we understand what the facts are, what the choices are, and that you get the chance in the lead up to actually casting your vote to say very loudly and clearly what choices you want your politicians to make. And so I think I must say I'm not so interested in the detailed understanding of personalities of individuals. We're going to come to the policies in detail. So that choice to be Prime Minister is one thing, but the decision was made, and we certainly didn't support the position that he took on marriage equality, for example.
Finally, Andrew Leigh.
Well, I think the comments that both Innes and Cassandra have pointed to go to the kind of policy-focused conversation, Sam, that I hoped we would have got after Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister. But I'm not sure there's a person in the country who feels that Malcolm Turnbull has outperformed their expectations since he took the top job. I think there's a real sense that someone who was willing to take that tough decision of crossing the floor on climate change and said that he would never lead a party that wasn't as committed to climate change action as he was, is now capitulating and running carbon tax scare campaign slogans and allowing Australia to slip behind the rest of the advanced world. We invest in renewables and we create new jobs for the future. A jobs and growth slogan needs to have renewables sitting in behind it. But Malcolm Turnbull's in thrall now to the right wing of the Liberal Party, that Faustian bargain you spoke about, and committed to spending $160 million on a divisive marriage equality plebiscite, as Cass has said, but yet willing to rip millions of dollars out of community legal aid, a sector that really needs the resources.
Okay, let's go to our next question. We've got quite a few questions to get through tonight, so we'll keep our answers tight. Holly Walker.
evening. My question to the panel is, across much of Europe, it's very common for progressive parties to form coalitions in government. What's the likelihood of, in the future, Labor and the Greens taking on this path?
Adam Bandt, with such a close election, you'd have to start thinking about this, wouldn't you?
Look, in 2010, Labor and Greens cooperated, and Tony Abbott told us it was the worst thing ever, and then we got Tony Abbott. And I think if you look back at that period, I think you will see that as one of the most productive periods. You look at Germany, as you mentioned. You look at Germany. They're on the way to generate 30% of their electricity from renewables. That's because back in the 90s they had Labor and the Greens cooperating together. That's what I would like to see happen. And if we do end up in a situation where, like 2010, where no one wins and everyone has to negotiate, then I would like to see Greens working with Labor. Sorry, Kelly, you're a nice person, but I think Liberal policies are reprehensible. And I would like
You have actually voted for a few of them.
I would like to see Greens working with Labor. I think the big question will be whether Labor wants to do it. We're up for it, and I think you'd want an agreement that delivers a stable and effective and progressive parliament, and everyone would have to give a bit because it would have to be reasonable. It means no one's won by definition, but it certainly, I think, it would help us kickstart, for example, clean energy and close the gap between the rich and the rest in this country.
So very briefly, sorry, Kelly, but if the Labor Party didn't want to play ball with you and in the way that happened last time with a Labor-Green alliance, would you force a new election?
Well, I know some people in Labor have said that they'll govern alone or not at all, and to me...
Quite a few.
And that to me suggests that they're saying, oh, well, look, we'd rather have a second election than allow the parliament that we've elected to work together. I think people in Australia would want a second election like a hole in the head, and I think that people in Australia, if they do vote that way, and some pollsters are saying, look, there's a 1 in 5 chance of parliament being like that again, I think the onus would be on all of us to work together, and I know hot heads in Labor would say it's my way or the highway, but I think wiser heads would prevail.
Kelly O'Dwyer plays perfectly into your scare campaign.
Well, look, I think everybody's actually seen what a Labor-Greens coalition actually looks like. That, I mean, we actually had that in 2010. We actually had the Labor Party form government with the Greens, and we saw the results of that. We saw ever-increasing spending. We saw huge deficits year after year, and lots and lots of borrowing.
That's what you've just predicted.
And of course, this was something that just had no end. Now, I think the Australian people want political stability. They want to know that the spending, the ever-increasing spending beyond what we actually have stops. And the reason is because they actually care about the next generation. They care that we bequeath to the next generation a better country than the country we have today. That's what I think every parent wants for their child. And I actually think that's what the Australian people want for the next generation.
All right, I want to hear briefly from Andrew on this question of what would happen if there's a hung parliament. Would you do a deal with the Greens like Labor did before?
Look, Holly, I'm not inclined to think that that's a good road to go down. The Greens have made a number of decisions over the years which have been deeply damaging. They voted down the emissions trading scheme in 2009, and an emissions trading scheme would be law of the land today if they hadn't done that. They voted against the Murray-Darling Basin plan, and they voted to take 2/3 of the private companies out of the tax transparency net at the end of last year.
Andrew, don't play politics.
So a range of the decisions that the Greens have made lead me to question whether they're really a party that is committed to governing or whether they're principally a party of protest. And you see that when you look at the seats they're targeting this time around. They're not targeting Liberals or Nationals, they're targeting some of the most progressive Labor members, people like Anthony Albanese and Tanya Plibersek. They're the sorts of people whose jobs the Greens are trying to take. And I don't think that advances the cause of progressive Australia to have progressives infighting rather than focusing on the coalition.
OK, we'll come back to you on this if there's a hung parliament. Let's go to our next question. It's from Duncan Storer.
I've got a disability. I've got a disability and a low education. That means I've spent my whole life working on for minimum wage. You're going to lift the tax-free threshold for rich people. If you lift my tax-free threshold, that changes my life. That means that I get to say to my little girls, Daddy's not broke this weekend, we can go to the pictures. Rich people don't even notice their tax-free threshold lift.
That's right.
Why don't I get it? Why do they get it?
Yeah.
I'm going to start with Cassandra Goldie.
I can't really add much more to the question other than to say this is exactly why on budget night we had to say we could not back what the government is again proposing to do, which is to, in this case, to spend billions in providing a tax cut for people at the $80,000 threshold. And a journalist said to me after the budget, said, you know, I listened to what we talked about the cuts to people on disability support pension, the way in which we're going to cut more welfare, including even reducing further the level of the unemployment payment, which hasn't been increased in over 2 decades. It's $38 a day to live on it. So many more people who have a disability are now have been pushed on to that unemployment payment. And that journalist said to me, you know, I listened to what you were saying and we could have done so much to change the lives of people who are on low incomes, to provide the kind of support for people with a disability, for example, to get employment, to get the kind of supports who would really have noticed the big difference that would have happened if you'd had a different approach. So we had always said in this effort to do the budget repair, you know, the balancing of the budget, that there was a particular part of the population sort of absolutely been protected, and not only protected from any cuts, but we needed more investment, and that was people such as yourself, who I assume is living on a low income and who is at risk of not necessarily having stable employment, and we need to be getting behind that part of it. And I think this choice, if I can just say, Tony, you opened up by saying we've got a debate going on between people and jobs and growth. It is not, these are not two opposing stories. The gentleman's question highlights that this is absolutely the same thing. And so we need to see a good competition in this election, which is about how we make sure people in your circumstances are absolutely at the top of the list in terms of really getting behind people, and that we are very careful about when we make a change to tax revenue that we can be absolutely confident that it's going to lift a job opportunity, particularly for people who are the most disadvantaged in the labour market. And I'm not sure we're there.
Kelly O'Dwyer, I'll come to you first, and then the other politicians.
Well, I think, look, thanks very much, Duncan, for that question. I think there are a couple of points really to make here. The first is that in not increasing unemployment payments doesn't mean that we've actually made a cut to unemployment payments, which is what Cass has just talked about. And I think it's an important point to make, because those people who are on unemployment payments are on transitional payments before we help those people to get back into work. And I think the key thing here is what can the government do to assist people in getting into work?
So Kelly, Duncan's question was something different. He was asking about lifting the tax-free threshold, and he said that would change his life and the lives of his children.
And I'm very happy to respond to that.
We'll come back to Duncan in a minute.
So the point I would make here is that it's not correct to say that we have provided a tax cut to the top taxpayers. We had a very, and in this budget, that actually hasn't changed at all, because there is a deficit reduction levy that was only legislated for a 3-year period that was supported by the Labor Party, and it's coming off. But that's got nothing to do with what was in this particular budget. We have increased for 500,000 Australians the ability to no longer be in the second highest tax bracket, to go from 80 to 87. That's true, but in the budget before that, we actually continued to give people carbon tax compensation for those under 80,000, when in fact there was no carbon tax and we got rid of it. So it's all about balance, and we believe we're making appropriate choices that are balanced. We have a progressive tax system.
But
those people
primarily
who earn more pay more tax.
For people earning more than $80,000 a year. That's what you're really talking about.
$4 billion a year, so that the top 25% of income earners can get $6 a week. It's, you know, sandwich and milkshake tax cut without the milkshake, and so that the top 25% of earners get a tax cut. That's $4 billion less to put in to job creation programs or schools and hospitals. And if you ask most people in this country, would you rather the top 25% of income earners get a tax cut, or would you rather we put the money into making Australia more equal? I know what most
Adam,
people
I'm just going to go back to our question. Now, Duncan, you heard what the Minister had to say. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, it's exactly that. To rich people, it's a Coke and a milkshake or whatever.
right.
To me, it changes my children's life. It means that my children have $7,000 more money every year to live on.
That's right.
Low income earners lose more money because every penny we pay in tax is that's money we don't have to spend at the bottom end. People who make $80,000 a year don't know who they are. Well, they don't even notice it, love. We notice that sort of stuff, eh?
So the critical thing here is that we actually need to grow the pie. I mean, Adam wants to redistribute the pie into ever more, smaller slices. We actually want to grow the pie. We want to grow the economy. We want to create more jobs. We want to give people an incentive to work, to invest in their businesses and to employ people and create better lives for themselves. That is what our plan is all about. I'm also the Small Business Minister. We have got a company tax cut for small businesses with a turnover of between $2 million and $10 million. Now, you might say, well, that's terrible, but it's not, because what it does is it creates more jobs. It will mean that those businesses can reinvest and employ more people. It will grow our economy. It will make us have a sustainable...
Kelly, well, hang on, before everyone gets
truth is
involved,
that
we've got another question related to this, and then I'll bring you in, Andrew. Hang on a second. The question is from Loretta Little.
Thanks, Tony. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz totally rejected the trickle-down theory of economics, where if you take care of the rich, the benefits will flow down to all. Why has the coalition designed the budget around the fallacy of Reaganomics and the Laffer curve?
I'll actually come to this side of the panel first, and I'll start with you, Andrew. We want to hear from Innes pretty quickly.
Loretta, I think you're absolutely right to talk about trickle-down economics, because this budget is premised on the notion that if we give a big tax cut to millionaires, a $17,000 tax cut to millionaires, that they'll employ more maids. And that notion simply misses the point that Duncan made. And Duncan, I wish your little girls were here to hear the way you made the most articulate critique of this year's budget that I've heard from anyone. Because you so clearly pointed out the value of money differs according to how much of it you've got. And that's why we believe that egalitarianism matters in Australia. We have this great bedrock of egalitarian values, a nation that doesn't stand up when the Prime Minister enters the room, doesn't much like tipping, where many of us sit in the front seat of taxis. But that's at threat from the rise in economic inequality we've seen in Australia, and at a time when earnings have risen 3 times as fast for the top 10th as the bottom 10th, the last thing we need is a budget that takes $4,500 away from a parent with 2 kids in high school and gives $17,000 to someone with $1 million income.
But you're supporting their tax cuts. You're supporting the tax cuts to the top 25% of income earners. That's $4 billion less to fund it. There's no point in growing the pie if only the rich get to eat the pie. Like, why?
But it's just that's just not a... I mean, Adam, you are actually you are a nice and a smart person, and that does you no justice and no credit to say that. We have we do have a progressive system here. I mean, you talk about millionaires and $17,000 tax cuts. I mean, if you're talking about somebody on $1 million, which is very few people in this country who are earning an income of that, they're also paying about $450,000 of tax because we have a progressive tax system. And that money goes into the welfare system, which actually helps people.
Let's go into the detail. The corporate tax cuts are going to cost $50 billion, best part of, over the next decade. Now, $7 billion of that goes to the big 4 banks. Now, do you, the most profitable in the world, do you really think that when they get $7 billion, they're going to employ $7 billion worth of people? Like, that's not what is going to happen with
Adam,
it. That's why
I'm going
Reaganomics
to cut you off because I want to hear from the other side of the table. I want to hear from a business perspective.
I've tried to be really polite. Duncan, I'll be harsh in my message. If you're on the minimum wage and with the family, you would not pay much tax, if any at all. Would you? You would not pay much tax.
Sorry,
But
Duncan
we're
wanted to
talking
respond to that.
about
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I pay tax every time I go to the supermarket. Every time I hop in my car.
As does everybody else who goes to the supermarket. So we have a situation here where not everyone can win out of every budget every time. It's not how the system works, and it's what the government has made a choice here, and I'll sort of talk on their behalf, although I'm not a member of the government. They've made a choice to actually try to create a situation where we can create jobs for Duncan's children, where we can create investment that doesn't come into the country now to provide for growth. Now, Adam talks about the corporate tax cut, as if it's Satan incarnated. What, according to the head of Treasury, it will do is actually drive $160 billion into the economy over 10 years. That's a pretty good return on a $50 billion investment. That will create the jobs of the future. That will create the investment of the future. That will create the opportunities of the future. That's what the business is trying to do. It will not create profits. So it's a pretty dark view of the world, Adam, that you have.
I'd rather put that money into an industry policy for Victoria, for the people who won't be able to build subs in South Australia and are about to lose their jobs. I'd rather that money goes into creating jobs of the future rather than to the banks for extra profits.
It will be creating the jobs of the future as business seeks to invest and grow. I mean, otherwise what you're going to do is you're going to have no investment in Australia. We pay proportionately the second highest rate of corporate tax in the OECD in Australia. It drives investment away. If you took the time to talk to any business person, they would say, Adam, when we look at investing in Australia, we look at your tax regime as a key part of it and as a disincentive to bring jobs, growth, innovation and opportunities.
So let's give tax breaks to the kind of industries that we want, like renewables, like medical research. But let's not give it to the banks.
Hold on. I'm just going to impose a small amount of order on the conversation, and I will throw to Andrew Leigh to hear what Labor's position is here, because you are supporting some of these tax cuts, that is to small business, but not to bigger business. So why make this distinction?
That's right, Tony. So the definition of small business in Australia is 2 million and under, and as Bill said in his budget reply last year, we're keen for those firms to get a tax cut. But we don't believe that with the deficit now higher than when it was in the Coalition One office, with debt up by $5,000 per Australian, it's the right time to give a $50 billion tax cut to some of the largest companies in Australia. And let's be clear how this works in the Australian context. We have dividend imputation, unlike almost all the rest of the OECD. So the effect of a company tax cut is mostly to funnel money to foreign shareholders. Now, Labor strongly supports foreign investment, but we have to be clear-eyed about who gets the benefits of this tax cut. Then the models anticipate, and this is the most optimistic scenario that Kelly and Innes would be putting to you, that ultimately those foreign shareholders will look to invest more in Australia, and that might flow through to higher household incomes. Treasury's own models have that being a 0.1% effect over the long run, with wage effects 7 to 10 years out. So if the Coalition's true promise is, with wage growth at a 30-year low, you're going to get a wage increase in 2026, it suddenly starts to look a whole lot less attractive, particularly if it then causes Moody's to take away our AAA credit rating.
Let me quickly go to Innes on this. Could you just address the dividend imputation issue? Paul Keating has been saying this for a very long time, that the people who benefit most from this corporate tax cut at the higher end are foreign shareholders.
Well, we've looked at putting forward the possibility of scrapping dividend imputation. That's a perspective.
But it hasn't been done.
No, but it's an option.
So why support the tax cut until you do it?
Because what you'll get from a tax cut as it is phased in, a corporate tax cut, just think of it this way, Tony, 0.1% of Australian businesses pay 60% of the corporate tax. They're at the big end. They are the last to get it in 2023, 24. Until then, a range of smaller businesses, currently now with the turnover of 10 million and it ratchets it up, will get the benefit of a tax cut and then benefit from accelerated depreciation. That will help them. It's a phased-in measure that will help smaller businesses who do quite frankly, most of the employing.
And
that's the key thing to take into account. It's not the
First-
top end of town
first of all, I
getting
want
a
to hear
tax
from
cut.
Cassandra, then I'll
It's
come
not the top
to
end
Kelly.
of town getting a tax cut
Okay.
tomorrow. That's what
Cassandra.
needs to be kept in mind.
Look, I said earlier, let's make sure that we do have a few of the facts that we're clear rather than perceptions. One of the first facts, and it comes from the Treasury's own tax discussion paper, is that we are one of the lowest taxing countries in the OECD.
And one of the highest corporate taxing.
Overall, in terms of the revenue, the really vital revenue we raise as a population to fund the things that we need, we are at the really low end, 6th lowest. So we had always said in this discussion about tax reform, we needed to go carefully and very clearly. If we are going to deliver a tax cut for personal income, when we've already had, during the boom era, 8 successive tax cuts on personal income rates, and that we've chosen the 80,000 one, which will benefit the top 20%. If you're a woman, 30% if you're male, that was the wrong choice, and we absolutely oppose it. Duncan's question, you're not right in us to say it doesn't matter at the low end. The interaction between the tax system and the transfer system makes a big difference to people in Duncan's situation. And we had always said to the government we were open to doing something there so that we were providing more benefit for people on low incomes who are going to be getting back into paid work.
All right.
But
And it will make a big difference to small business.
Guys, we have a lot of other questions to get through.
If we're going to be moving with tax reform, we need some of the tax concessions dealt with, and there's a whole lot of missing in action on that front, and we deliver the tax cuts without
Kelly O'Dwyer,
rolling
a brief
those back.
response.
Very briefly, what I would say is what we've heard from both Labor and the Greens here tonight is that they want to increase taxes, personal income taxes and company taxes. That's going to put a handbrake on our economy. Now, I have sat down with small business because I'm the small business minister and I've talked to them. One of the cafe owners I spoke to the other day has got a turnover of just over 2 million. As a result of our change, our tax cut on the 1st of July of this year, he will have access to the instant asset write-off, which means he can invest in his business. A $6,000 toaster, which means he can get more customers through his business on a Saturday when there's a bottleneck, more customers through his business because toast is that bottleneck that he needs to clear in order to get more people in. He's going to derive more revenue, and he's told me that he is going to put more people on. I mean, this is the result of the changes we are making. It will affect people's lives in a very positive way.
Okay, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, don't be too surprised if you do. It's election time after all, but you can help keep our politicians truthful by sending a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda so that ABC Fact Check and The Conversation can check for dodgy claims. Now, the next question comes from Paul O'Neill.
Adam, our record national debt leaves us exposed and vulnerable for when the next global financial crisis hits. Had the debt ceiling not been lifted, Australia would have been forced to live within its means. Yet you, Adam, have argued that the debt ceiling should be completely abolished. The current $500 billion of debt ceiling will be reached early in the next term of Parliament. In the Senate, you have blocked nearly all budget repair measures. When will the Greens support a strategy and policies to commence repaying this debt? Or are you happy to pass on this record debt as a millstone which will hang around the necks of our children and also of our grandchildren? Thank you.
Adam Bandt.
Yeah, so it was actually Joe Hockey who proposed abolishing the debt ceiling, and we voted for it because it was our policy as well. So one of those instances where, from the Liberals' perspective, even a stop clock is right twice a day. But remember, that was Joe Hockey who said, let's get rid of the debt ceiling. Look, the ratings agencies, and you've got to ask, in the light of the global financial crisis, do you really want to take them for gospel? But the rating agencies have said, look, one of the issues in Australia is that have you got enough revenue coming in to service the debt? For me, the question is, like, every household, like, if you've got a mortgage, you're in debt. Like, people understand that to borrow makes sense if at the end of it you've got a productive asset. To borrow to meet your current expenditure, maybe not such a good idea. To borrow because you're investing in infrastructure, very, very good idea. Now, so when people say, let's have this debt phobia, I would say back, that's not the right question. The right question is, if we could borrow now, taking advantage of this AAA credit rating, I mean, what's the point of being able to borrow money so cheaply if you don't do it to fund productive infrastructure? Let's borrow now to fund things like high-speed rail and renewable energy so that we create the things that will generate income for the next generation. My concern is that if we just keep going down this road of a tax cuts arms race and saying we don't need to worry about the revenue side, it's all going to come crashing down in about 10 or 15 years' time.
Okay, there's a question. Well, first of all, there's another question on debt, and I'll come to you in a second, Innes, but this one's for Kelly O'Dwyer. It's from Cameron Warasta.
Given that under this government, the deficit has tripled, growth has been stagnant, and Commonwealth government spending as a percentage of GDP is estimated to be at 25.8% this year, which is higher than all but one of the Rudd-Gillard years, how can we believe that the Liberal Party is a party of fiscal conservatism, higher growth and small government?
Well,
Kelly.
look, so Cameron, you know, it's a good question, but it comes with a false premise. You know, you've got to understand the starting point that this government inherited, and you have to compare it to the starting point of the previous Labor government. It had no net debt. There was money in the bank in the Future Fund. Peter Costello had at that stage repaid back $96 billion of Labor's debt. We were in a very, very strong financial position. And during that time, they ratcheted up increased debts through deficit after deficit because they couldn't pay for their spending. And we had spending going up a trajectory of which, you know, was really increasing year on year. Now, we inherited that coming into government, and we said, it's got to stop. We've got to pull it back.
But didn't it actually, to be fair, didn't it actually get worse?
Well, no, but we have decreased. No, well, Tony, look, you can sort of make those sort of snide comments about it, but what I would say...
I'm sorry, that's just a factual observation.
Well, but we have decreased the growth in spending. We are actually winding it back because we know you have to wind it back in order to make sure that future generations are not going to be paying the bill, you know, forever. I mean, there comes a point, and we've seen this in Europe, there actually comes a point where you can't wind it back, right? So you actually need to make responsible decisions today in order to make sure that you live within your means. And we have been doing that. We are actually decreasing the amount that we are spending, and we are reducing the deficit. We're reducing the deficit from $39 billion to $6 billion over the forward estimates, and we're bringing it back every year so that we can start to repay back that enormous debt that both the Labor Party and the Greens left us.
Okay,
Cameron, I think...
Well, yes, you can, quickly.
Cameron, I think that the Liberals sometimes want to have one of those little machines like they had in Men in Black that sort of wipes your memory and so you can't remember what happened back in 2013. I mean, this was a party that said in 2012 that the budget would be in surplus in their first year and in every year after that.
You said we'd have
and
four
yet
surpluses.
we've seen the deficit increase, we've seen debt go up, and Malcolm Turnbull's debt truck that he proudly unveiled back in 2009 would now be a debt road train, if they were being accurate. The thing is, I'm concerned about what this does to our credit rating. This is only the second budget in the last decade where Standard & Poor's hasn't given a post-budget assessment. That suggests they're concerned. Moody's has already warned that the government's inability to do something on the revenue side as well as the spending side threatens the AAA credit rating. And once it's gone, it takes a long time to get back. When we lost it in the 1980s, it took 17 more years before the AAA credit rating came back. And when Canada lost their AAA credit rating in the early 1990s, it took a decade to win back. So it's really important that the government takes seriously the warning from Moody's, because even if the only thing you care about is corporate profits, if companies have to pay more on their business loans because we've lost the AAA credit rating, then that might be a bad deal, even if they get a
Kelly, because Labor has actually lost our AAA credit rating before, and we actually got it back.
Okay, so I want to hear from the business perspective. Innes Willox sitting there quietly steaming away.
I'm not steaming, I'm just laughing at them all. The fact is, Cameron and Paul before you, we have now had 8 years of deficits. It's a longer run than through the 1970s oil shock, through the 1980s recession, the 1990s recession. It's the longest run of deficits that we've had in modern Australian history. We now have $325 billion worth of deficit racked up. It's 18% of GDP, and it costs us $12.6 billion a year in interest payments. That's 12.6 billion wasted dollars every year. Now, if we can get that debt down, some debt and deficit is good. To Adam's point, it can fund infrastructure and the like. The fact is we've gone on a debt and deficit binge, and we're looking at another 3 or 4 years of it at least. So I think I'm hearing from Andrew sort of a promise almost to get a budget in surplus in the first year. I think, without verbling, that was sort of what...
No, I was saying that was what the coalition pledged.
But that, I think, was sort of what you were suggesting you would do too. And if you could do that would be... So he doesn't want to do it either. So what we're looking
we're not going to make promises we can't keep.
So what we're looking at is prolonged debt and deficit, and it comes back in a way to Duncan's question earlier on. We have to make some choices about the economy of the future that we want. If we want to keep going, we will lose our AAA credit rating. There's no doubt about that. And that will have impact not just for the federal government in its borrowings, but also for the state governments who want to borrow and build infrastructure as well. That's why it's crucial to start to drive this down, from our perspective, that government, no matter what side, get its spending house under control.
Okay, we're going to move. Sorry, we're going to
raising revenue as well.
That's
so
right.
It's not just about spending. There's the revenue side.
But then
and
you're
that's where we've
driving
had
away
far
investment.
Okay, we've got a
on that
question.
front.
We've got a question that affects an awful lot of young people, in particular. Housing affordability is the subject, and the questioner is Abir Ahmed.
Thanks, Tony. Like many young Australians, my partner and I found ourselves frozen out of a very hostile property market that is stacked up against us. This budget completely ignores this, and we can't ask our parents to shell out. What measures would the panel propose need to be put into place so that first-time home buyers right now have the same access to the housing market as the generations before us?
Cassandra, let me start with you.
Well, look, isn't it great that we're actually, I think maybe we've got a really big debate going on in this country about housing affordability, because the politics seem to have missed it for a long time. We're very clear. We think that negative gearing needs to be removed. You grandfather it, but into the future, gone. You need to reduce the discount on the capital gains growth. That needs to be brought right back to about 25%. Those two measures are significant and important in stopping the fueling of the trajectory about the growth in housing prices. The other thing, of course, is about supply, okay, because that's part of it. So in our view, some of the savings from what you do there should be put into a sort of a proper tool for encouraging better big investment in new supply, including from institutional investors like superannuation funds, so that we're getting very serious about affordable housing. It is important for business. This was a big debate at the National Reform Summit. We need people to be able to up and move where the jobs are, for that to be easy. The other big reform, which is actually both in terms of tax reform and housing affordability, is a switch to get rid of stamp duties over time and to broaden the base of land taxes. Now that's a state reform, but the Commonwealth Government has a key role in encouraging that. That would have been a good, not a thought bubble, but a serious proposal for the Commonwealth Government to put to the states, and we really hope that they do that. So there are a number of levers, but it cannot go in the too hard basket anymore for all the reasons you say.
I want to hear from both of our non-politicians first. Ines, I'd like to hear from you. And let's bear this in mind. There was an internal memo from the Reserve Bank that's been published today, which says that the bank thought that any change which discouraged negative gearing might be a good thing for financial stability. What does business think about this?
Well, firstly, Amir, I feel your pain. Completely feel your pain, don't worry. With a bunch of kids to think about, I don't know how they're going to get into the housing market either, and they struggle.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull had an answer for you.
Well, don't look at me. Don't look at me. I can't help you either. Look, it's a really tough question, and there's a lot of bits to balance in this equation. We've just gone through a residential construction boom in Australia, which is tapering off. You've got to wonder who's doing the buying for that. The issue of housing is part of the Australian dream, but we also need to be mobile. So Cass's point about stamp duties is completely right. It's one of the greatest rip-offs of all time, state stamp duties. And there are ways you can get around that. So if a government wants to think big and bold about tax, Tony, let me just put an idea out there for you. What if we implemented something like a federal land tax, say at 5 cents a square metre? That could raise about $200 billion. You could get rid of state land tax duties, you could get rid of payroll tax, you could get rid of a whole range of other taxes with that sort of tax manoeuvre, which would bring money into the federal government, would allow mobility, would probably drive prices down in housing stock, and would make it easier for young people to buy. Unfortunately, I think we're about to witness the first generation since the Second World War, which will have lower standard of living in some ways than their parents. But you know, the Reserve Bank is one of the few banks in the world still with a little bit left in its arsenal when it comes to monetary policy.
Okay, what about the point that I just made, though, about their position on negative gearing? Behind the scenes, arguing that maybe it should be changed, and along with that, capital gains tax rate.
Well, I think that's a debate and an issue. That sort of tax change in that tax mix, that's the sort of discussion we have to have, and that's been the sad point.
But we're not having it. In fact, we're
Tony.
Now having what we're now having is a political fight.
Exactly, and that's what we need to have. When I talked earlier about substance over style, that's the sort of debate that Australia needs to have to reshape our economy to meet the challenges of the 21st century.
You don't think that debate was really had?
No, it was cut off in its prime. We have not really had a debate around changes to the GST and all that would involve. That ended way too fast. We haven't had a serious debate about federal-state taxation arrangements. That got put up by the Prime Minister and it's not going anywhere. So we are suffering from not having the debates, and that's why you can feel the frustration in the room, and you can feel the frustration in our broader community and in the business community, most importantly, that we're just not having the debates we have to have.
Let's
and
hear from
people
the other.
Are sick of it.
Let's hear from the politicians now, and we'll start with Andrew Leigh.
Beer, I meet people in my electorate every week who've got stories like yours. A policeman and a teacher who came up to me at a street stall saying that they didn't know how they could afford a home if they wanted one of them to take some time out of the workforce to raise a child. In the early 1990s, buying a house in a big Australian city cost 5 times the average young Australian's income. Now it's up to 15 times. And yet the Prime Minister's advice to young people is to get yourself rich parents. You know, poor Malcolm, he really was born with a silver foot in his mouth. And the debate that we've been leading here with Labor's policies is one in which tackles the issue that so many experts have talked about. The combination of negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount has acted to favour property speculators over first home buyers. Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen have gone out there and put our plans on the table. We've been very clear that this is a measure that we believe will improve housing affordability and add to the budget bottom line. And we've had experts from across the political spectrum back us in and say that this is a reform that Australia needs. And today, as Tony said, the Reserve Bank's come out and said that it will help add to financial stability. Malcolm Turnbull of old, in 2005, said that negative gearing was skewed to the very top. But now he seems to be defending it and suggesting somehow contrary to the facts that negative gearing isn't more common among surgeons and anaesthetists than it is among teachers and nurses. But the fact shows that half the benefits are out of the top 10.
People on average income also work on negative gearing, Tony, because they see it as an investment that will bear fruit over time.
Well, I suspect that Kelly O'Dwyer is about to tell us that. I'm going to give her the chance to do it.
Yeah, well, I think, thank you, Amir, for that question. And I think a lot of people actually feel, very strongly about this issue because, frankly, everybody in Australia wants to be able to have the ambition and the reality of owning their own home. Now, Andrew has said that the RBA has come out and made these statements. It hasn't, actually. There was an FOI on a 2014 document that isn't an official RBA document. And if Andrew actually wants to adopt what's in that document, it also goes on to say that, in fact, if you get rid of negative gearing, you're going to push up rents. And in my electorate of Higgins, where I've got around about 23,000 renters, pushing up rents isn't a great thing either. But Andrew's policy that has been put forward by the Labor Party isn't the solution to your problem. What they have said is it's going to be okay for people who are very, very wealthy, investment bankers and others who have got other investment income. They're going to be allowed to negatively gear. They're going to be allowed to deduct it against their other investment income. Andrew won't deny that because that's the case. But the average income earner who relies on a salary or a wage won't be able to do that. And 2/3 of people who negatively gear, 2/3 of people have an income of around about $80,000 or less. And that is more than 47,000 teachers who negatively gear, more than 40,000 nurses and midwives negatively gear. So it is simply not correct. Now, Labor is either being dishonest with their policy or they don't understand their own policy. And the reason Andrew is silent is because he knows I am right.
He's
Give me a response. I'm happy to go in. So the $80,000 figure is taxable income. In other words, that's the income after we've taken account of negative gearing. Half of the benefits of negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount go to the top 10th
but
of
your
Australians.
policy favours the wealthy.
This is a system which is skewed very heavily to the top. Before we put in place the capital gains tax discount, net rental income was positive in Australia. Now it's negative. We're encouraging people to buy assets, not with the normal aim of making a return, but actually encouraging them to make a loss.
I'm sorry, no, just excuse me, because we've got another question on this subject. I'm going to go to it now and we can all comment on it. It's from Mark Schulberg. Go on, Mark.
Kelly, with the retrospective and complicated changes to the superannuation, it looks like the only legal remaining tax haven is the personal home. Surely this is going to crank up negative gearing with a view to getting capital gains tax-free money on the sale and push prices up. Now, is that the right signal to send for economic growth with all this money tied up in non-performing assets?
I'm going to start with Adam Bandt here. The argument being that if you close down a tax loophole in super, a lot of that money could go straight back into housing using negative gearing and the capital gains tax loophole.
Answer both of those questions at once. When Kevin Rudd came to power, young people in this country had 10% of the country's wealth. When Tony Abbott came in his first year, it was down to 5%, right? And it used to, a generation or so ago, it used to take about 6 times the average young person's income to buy a home. Now it's up to 12. And more young people are in casual work than we've ever had before. Young people are getting screwed. The economy has declared war on the young under Labor and Liberal, and we are going to need the mother of all shake-ups to ensure that we have some generational equity. And to answer your question specifically about what we could do and to answer both of them, I think you do 3 things. One is, let's draw a line under negative gearing and say it was a good lurk while it lasted for those who could get it, but it's come at a cost and it's time to bring it to an end, full stop. If you've got it, you can keep it, but if you haven't got it, you don't get it in the future. And we were the first out of the blocks with that, and I'm pleased that it's been partly picked up. Second is the capital gains tax exemption, which allows people who've got shares and houses to pay less tax and get a discount than people who earn their money from just pay-as-you-go wages. That needs to come off as well. Thirdly, let's say that Gina Rinehart perhaps doesn't need a tax break so that she can buy cheap diesel fuel. That gives us, let her pay the same tax on her fuel as everyone else in Australia pays on their petrol. That gives us a couple of $2 billion a year. Let's put that money into the Commonwealth borrowing sensibly to build affordable housing in this country and to build more public housing. I mean, we've got almost $2 trillion in superannuation funds sitting in this country. What better thing to get them investing in than affordable housing rented at below market rents? We can do this. It'll take a bit of courage, but we can do it.
Okay, I'm going to hear from Cassandra, Goldie and Innes.
Look, I think Adam's point about really getting a good, big investment into affordable housing and public housing is bang on. So, you know, we want to work on that big time, and we have to start yesterday. The point, though, about the superannuation reforms that are proposed in this budget, first thing I do want to say I think that the proposals that the coalition have come up with are absolutely in the right direction. I think they certainly probably went further than some people thought that they might. They were definitely about paring it back at the high end. Yes, it was good to put the low income protection back in to make sure that low income people were not penalised in the superannuation environment, and it's an extremely good start. It could have gone further, but of course probably ACOS would say that. However,
let's quickly address the question.
I think this question about what it will do to investment decisions is really important. It's one of the reasons why when we were talking about tax reform, like really good tax reform, we had said we should move with bringing back these distortions, these tax breaks over particular kinds of investments, which were no longer, yes, fit for purpose, so that there was a more consistent treatment of investment income. We should have been doing both at the same time, so that ideally we're encouraging those who have got extra money, who have got the ability to invest, to be investing in really exciting new industries and job opportunities, not in existing real estate, speculating,
Cassandra,
hoping.
just very briefly, I'm sorry to jump in, but we're running out of time. But do you agree with the point of the question, which is that money will flow out of these high-end super schemes into property and again be another aspect of fueling the housing bubble?
Well, absolutely. And also, of course, we've got interest rates going lower again. And so there is this real risk that we're going to have more and more speculative investment in the property market. We're very worried that small investors will still be chasing, hoping that that might be a good investment for them. And then interest rates go up and it could get very, very ugly for people who are small investors.
Can I just play a game of audience participation here? How many of you have got over $1.6 million in your superannuation account? One, two. Out of this room, so out of a couple of hundred. I have to disclose, I sit on the board of Australian Super. We co-own it. We asked the question at our board meeting last week, how many people in our fund of over 2.1 million people have over 1.6 million? And it's way less than 1,000. It's about 500 actually. The reality is this is not going to impact on many people. I think there's sort of been a lot of sort of hysteria about this, but it's not actually going to impact.
But it is going to raise billions of dollars. So the amounts of money, even though the numbers of people are small, are big. And the question was, will that money go straight from super into property because the tax breaks are still there?
It may go that way, but it will also mean that people have to think, at that sort of stratospheric level of either income or savings, have to think very cleverly about where to put their savings. And at a time of rising house prices, or they may not have enough left over or whatever. I mean, there could be a whole, you can't, I think, extrapolate that one will cause the other. Where we need to look at more broadly is to getting the tax on super fair and balanced, and that's where the next argument needs to go.
Kelly O'Dwyer, just a quick answer on the question about the money flowing from the high-end super into property and fueling the boom even further.
Well, I think Ines is right. You can't make that extrapolation.
Would it be a good thing or a bad thing from your point of view if it did? Because you want housing prices to go up, don't you?
Well, no. I mean,
no, you don't.
That's. I mean, I'm not sure, Tony, what you're getting at there, other than to say.
Well, it's a simple question. Do you want housing prices to go up or not?
So let me respond to the question that's actually been put, because I think Tony, it's a serious question and actually deserves a serious response rather than sort of a flippant aside. I don't accept the premise of your question that these changes are retrospective. These changes will apply from the 1st of July 2017, where people, less than 1% of the population with super funds who've got more than 1.6 million in their superannuation will have a transfer ceiling on what can be put into their retirement income account. Now, there'll be some people who say, I've got more than that and it's not fair, but they will still be able to keep their additional amounts in superannuation in an accumulation account. The only element that applied from budget night was the $500,000 non-concessional lifetime caps. We think that that is appropriate. It is a balanced policy, but the reason we have done it is because we also want to build flexibility into the system. We want to be able to have people make catch-up contributions, and those people with caring responsibilities will be able to do that as a result of our changes. We want to care for people on low incomes, and we've got the low income tax offset. We want to give people who have got low income partners the ability to contribute to their super and get a tax offset. So there has been a huge amount of flexibility that we have also built into the system as a result of these changes.
We've got time for one last question. I'm sorry about that. It comes from Sarah McCall-Gorsden.
As a young person and a science student, I was really disappointed and frustrated that Scott Morrison failed to mention climate change, renewable energy, or even the environment in his recent budget speech. Climate change is one of the biggest threats to our environment, our health, and our future. A transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy seems to align perfectly with the government's mantra of jobs and growth. But can anyone please explain why there is no plan for this transition in the budget?
Okay, we've got... It's a very big question. We'll be dealing with it more than once during the campaign, I'm sure. We've got time for short answers. Adam Bandt first.
In 2016, any responsible budget would have climate change at the front and centre. You look at Germany, it is a leading light in the financial crisis sweeping Europe, and they are making the renewables transition. If we had we need a snowy hydro for the 21st century, and it's going to be renewables, and it'll mean jobs, and it'll mean we will have something to sell the rest of the world in 15 years' time that isn't coal.
Kelly O'Dwyer, and perhaps you just address why it wasn't mentioned in the budget.
Well, I think we actually have to just go to the substance. I mean, either you actually believe the government should be doing something about it and you're interested in hearing about that, or whether or not it was actually mentioned in the budget. Now, I think it's important that the government is actually doing something about this. I mean, we have got a very ambitious target for 2030. We're reducing our emissions by between 26 and 28% on 2005 levels, and we are on track to actually beat that. And per capita, we are up there with Brazil on actually having the highest emissions reductions in the world. Now, I actually think you should be looking at outcomes rather than looking at, whether a word was mentioned or not mentioned.
Cassandra Goldie, first of all, sorry.
Look, for people who are vulnerable, for young people, for older people, for people who have very little resources behind them, climate change is extremely serious. We know that it will be people on the lowest incomes, those who are the most vulnerable, they're already being hit the first and the worst. More people die in heat waves than in floods and bushfires. This is really serious, and so we implore the political process to put this front and centre, to try as best as you can not to run scare campaigns during this election, and to step it up, because every year that goes by, it's happening now. And we, as the voice of the social, says we can absolutely do good social policy, economic policy, and really great environmental policy at the same time, and that's what we should want.
Andrew Leigh.
Sarah, I think the simple reason is that Malcolm Turnbull's embarrassed that his own party isn't as committed to climate change as he is. His policy of direct action has now spent 2/3 of the money, but got not quite 1/10 of what the emissions reduction it's meant to get. We've got electricity sector emissions rising in Australia. Labor believes we need more ambitious climate targets in line with what the Climate Change Authority recommends, and that we should get to zero net emissions by 2050. We've got to do it because, as Cassandra has said, it's the most vulnerable who are at risk, the people who don't have the air conditioners, who are most likely to be affected by the extreme weather events that we know will accompany dangerous climate change.
Innes.
Thanks, Tony. Look, it's a question we're going to be debating for years. The fact is that last year the government and opposition came to agreement around a renewable energy target, so that is in place. Both parties have variations around emissions reduction. The government 26 to 28% by 2030, Labor Party somewhere around 45%. Let's be upfront here. Both parties have an enormous amount of work to do after the election, no matter who wins, to fill in the gaps. There is a place in Australia for renewable energy. Wind and solar is cheap at the moment. The fact is the system is full. We need to get the mix between renewables and fossils right. You see in South Australia at the moment, electricity prices double because they haven't been able to get that mix right. So we just need to work this through in a patient, constructive way. Renewables have a great place in Australia. The one thing, if you're looking about getting emissions down, and we'll end on this note, is why aren't we looking at nuclear? That's where you want to go if you want to get emissions down.
I won't end quite on that note. Kelly O'Dwyer, I mean, around the panel, strong consensus that more needs to be done. Is there going to be a commitment from the government during the campaign to do more than it currently is?
Well, we've given a very strong commitment. We gave that commitment to the international community as well in Paris. And as I said to you before, that commitment is better than most other countries per capita. I actually think Australia can be very proud of what we're doing. We're doing what we can do and more. And I think it's quite irresponsible of Andrew to say that he wants an even higher target, because of course the only way that he'll be able to deliver that is to impose new taxes, such as a new carbon tax, and we will see a huge rise in electricity prices. We know that because the Treasury have actually modelled a similar proposal in the past, and wholesale electricity prices went up by 78%, and they lead to higher electricity prices. So I just think
you just started off another whole debate, so I'm going to wind you up there.
Well, we just need to be honest about this.
All right.
We need to be honest about the effect of climate change as well. And if the Prime Minister can't be honest about the effect of climate change, and the fact that if we don't get the ship turned around within the next couple of decades, then all of this is going to count for naught, then that is the most dishonest thing you can do.
Cass and I sit on a climate change roundtable with business, unions, community groups. We've had enough of all of this squabbling over climate policy. We actually want principled outcomes that lead us to getting our emissions down in a responsible way over the long term, and us contributing to our role in the globe. But let's not beat ourselves up. No matter what we do, we aren't huge emitters in a global sense, but we do have a role to play, and we want a debate that works for everyone.
Quite a few debates that aren't working for everyone, because it is an election campaign. So that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Innes Willox, Cassandra Goldie, Andrew Leigh, Kelly O'Dwyer, Adam Bandt. Thank you very much. Now, next Monday, and it'll be a relief for some, not for others, we'll take a breather from the election campaign when we combine forces with the Sydney Writers' Festival and the Centre for Independent Studies to bring together the women's rights activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whose latest book, Heretic, argues for the reformation of Islam, award-winning performance poet, musician and novelist Kate Tempest, a former French ambassador and co-founder of Doctors Without Borders, Jean-Christophe Ruffin, and Middle East specialist Emma Sky, who served as an advisor to the US military in Iraq, and finally best-selling British philosopher Julian Baggini. Until next week's Q&A, good night.